On this day, in 1919, one of the most unbelievable yet little known events occurred in Brisbane. For some months, tension had been brewing between elements of Brisbane's population and the government over the use or misuse of the War Precautions Act, a piece of legislation enacted to allow the federal government to pass whatever laws were deemed necessary to ensure the success of the war effort in Australia, oftentimes at the expense of free speech and civil rights. After the cessation of World War I, the Act continued to be utilised for controversial means by the government, including the prohibition of the red flag, a symbol of socialism or communism and the trade union movement. On the 23rd of March, a sizable demonstration of 400 unionists gathered in Brisbane to protest the continued use of the Act, with the Industrial Council having been issued a permit for the procession on the understanding that no red flags were to be displayed during the march. Despite the strict stipulation, a number of marchers insisted on flying the red flag in defiance during their travels from the Trade Hall and down into Queen Street, resulting in multiple altercations with the awaiting police. As the crowd finally moved down Edward Street under the offending banner and onto the Domain, they were met with a contingent of mounted police. However, given the procession's numbers, reinforcements were soon called for before the authorities attempted in vain to identify the troublemakers. As the evening wore on, a number of well-organised returned World War I soldiers, concerned about the growing Russian influence in Brisbane, also arrived on the scene, hell-bent on disrupting the speakers who had been brought in to address the throng of unionists. As additional clashes with the unionists ensued, the gathering speakers were tipped off their platform with an additional threat from the ex-soldiers that any further attempt at speaking would see them thrown into the Brisbane River from the nearby bridge. The attending police, seeing an impending bloodbath on their hands, promptly bundled the speakers into a tramcar for South Brisbane and hoped the night of chaos was at an end. Unfortunately, it was not. The milling throng of servicemen decided to march on the Russian Workers' Association Hall at Maryvale Street in South Brisbane in an act of retaliation. As the returned soldiers neared the hall, the Russians within fired several shots into the approaching crowd. Halting immediately due to the shots, a plainclothes constable approached the group and advised that police in a nearby alleyway had observed at least 50 to 60 people in the Russian club rooms, all of whom were armed with either revolvers or rifles and appeared ready to fight to the finish. The crowd of servicemen begrudgingly dispersed, but only back across the bridge to Victoria Barracks, where they demanded immediate issuance of firearms and ammunition. Very fortunately, their demands were denied. Not willing to let the previous afternoon's situation rest, on the evening of the 24th of March, a crowd of nearly 8,000 gathered at North Quay to discuss the government's apparent lack of action on the previous day. During the proceedings, a large group of a few thousand men broke away from the pack and again marched on the Russian Hall in Maryvale Street at South Brisbane, stripping front yards of fence palings as they proceeded. On nearing the hall, the procession found their way blocked by about 60 police on horseback, this time armed with rifles affixed with bayonets. Within seconds, the two opposing forces clashed. What became known as the Red Flag Riot raged for 2 hours between the police and the breakaway civilian force, whilst the Russian hall was pelted with fence palings and miscellaneous missiles, and local businesses were damaged and looted. At one stage, a man who attempted to interject was dragged back towards the bridge with the intent of tossing over, but was saved in the nick of time by the attending police. By the end of the fracas, over 100 men were wounded, many by bayonet, including the police commissioner Mr. Urquhart in the shoulder and Mr. Archdale, the police chief magistrate, in the groin. Numerous shots were also fired, with casualties on either side given both had armed themselves accordingly, with the only fatality being a police horse that died shortly after from its wounds. All in all, the Red Flag Riot in Maryvale Street in South Brisbane goes down in history as likely the closest Brisbane came to open warfare in the streets. A handful of other similar riots have occurred in Brisbane over the years, however, those stories remain for another day.